Welcome to all of you to the 2014 Nora and Edward L. Ryerson Lecture. This is a lecture series that's held annually. It's made possible by a bequest from Edward L. Ryerson, who was a former chair of the board of the University of Chicago. That is just one part of the connection that the Ryersons have had to the university over many generations. George Ranney, who many of you know, has represented the family very ably at many of these events. George can't be with us tonight, but we're very happy to have Allison Ranney here, who will say a few words after dinner, as members of the family always have done. This is actually 40 years to the day since the first Ryerson lecture was given in 1974 by John Hope Franklin. This is an extraordinary series, and if you leaf through the list of University of Chicago faculty members who have given this lecture since that time, 40 years ago, you actually get a very powerful snapshot of some of the intellectual history of the University of Chicago. And of course, what that means is that you get a snapshot of the intellectual history of the Academy, really since the middle part of the 20th century to the present. Part of the reason that this is such a distinguished lecture series is the way that the lecturer is chosen, which is by a faculty committee through nominations of the faculty. This is perhaps the greatest expression of the University of Chicago faculty recognizing one of our own as someone who should be speaking to the entire community about the nature of their work over time. So it's really a wonderful tradition, and we are delighted that the speaker today is John Goldsmith. Let me just I remember some things about John's background, but not every single thing. I will not do an extensive introduction, but John, as many of you know, is a member of the Linguistics department and the Computer Science department. Now, not only is he a member of both of these departments, but he has been chair of both of these departments. And I believe, though I actually have not checked the record, that he may be the unique person in the university's history to have been chair of a department in the Humanities Division and the Physical Sciences Division. John is the Edward Carson Waller Distinguished Service Professor, and he's also a fellow of the Computation Institute in addition to his two departmental appointments. John was a philosophy major at Swarthmore College. He studied linguistics at MIT under Morris Halle and Noam Chomsky. He taught for 8 years at Indiana University, came to the University of Chicago Linguistics Department in 1984, where he began an analysis of machine learning in addition to his work on things that traditionally take place in linguistics department. And he joined the University of Chicago's Computer Science Department in 2003. His lecture today is entitled Language and the Mind, Encounters in the Minefields, and we're delighted to have John Goldsmith.
Thank you, Bob, and colleagues throughout the divisions and the schools. I'm going to move this. Very grateful for the honor of speaking to you today. I'm mindful of the tradition of scholarship that precedes me in the Ryerson lecture, and the tradition of scholarship and teaching that defines us as a faculty. And I'm grateful for the community of the mind that you've shared and shaped and which I benefit from each and every day when I come here and have been here over the last 30 years. And this is indeed a special event, and one which I've enjoyed as a member of the audience for more times than I care to count. But it's only this year that I've really come to understand that it's really a big deal. And I came to understand that last Thursday morning, in fact, at 11:15. And I had just finished producing one of the videos that I'm going to show you in a little bit, and I walked over to the coffee shop in the bookstore on Ellis, and I got online, and when I got to the head of the line, the woman, instead of saying, "What can I get started for you today?" she said, "Big day's coming, huh?" And I had no idea what she was talking about, and I figured it's too late for the Super Bowl and it's too early for the World Series, and I don't know if opening day has happened yet for the Cubs. And so before I said anything, the woman next to her said, "What's happening?" And she turned to her coworker and said, "Don't you read, girl? He's giving the Ryerson lecture next week." And so I am. I'd like to speak to you today about linguistics and one way in which linguistics interacts with computer science, that part of computer science called machine learning. It's always been a great pleasure for me to be a member of a university where you can be a member of the Department of Linguistics and the Department of Computer Science, and nobody thinks it's all that strange. But I do know that linguistics has a reputation on the street for being esoteric and even a bit obscure, and the reputation is not entirely undeserved. I was reminded of this a few years ago. I came home after teaching a seminar on something, phonology or morphology or something, and in the paper was this cartoon from Frank and Ernest, and Frank, the psychiatrist, says, "First we'll analyze your inferiority complex through word association, and the first word is morphophonemics." So I remembered that strip, and I decided I was not going to talk to you about morphophonemics tonight. But I did remember that a few years later, Woody Allen had a piece in the New Yorker. Maybe some of you have seen it, and if you had, I hope you haven't forgotten it. He described a range of things that Japanese geishas were trained in, and he explained that one could drink tea with a geisha, one could learn about formal flower arrangement with a geisha, or other things. And the highest position among the geishas is reserved for those geishas who can explain Chomsky's generative grammar to you. Now, I know that all the geishas who are certified to teach Chomsky's generative grammar have now retired. So I thought that I would undertake to explain one or two of the more esoteric and exotic aspects of the system and show you how they reflect the time in which they were proposed. And times have changed, and the development of machine learning sheds new light on some of the ideas that were current in the 1950s and the 1960s. Well, the 1960s saw the emergence of a new perspective in linguistics that was opened up by Noam Chomsky and Morris Halle at MIT. And the two of them embodied much of the best of the preceding generation of linguists. Chomsky had been the student of Zelig Harris, who had learned his linguistics from the two greatest linguists of the first half of the 20th century. They were Edward Sapir and Leonard Bloomfield, both of whom had the best times of their professional lives here at the University of Chicago. Unfortunately, they both moved to Yale afterward and had a terrible time. But Harris himself, Zelig Harris, was a professor at Penn, and he was a brilliant thinker. He was a charismatic man. And while many of his students went on to be world leaders in linguistics, he didn't have a system as such which he could pass on to them, which was then presented to the world. Morris Halle, who developed generative grammar along with Chomsky, was the student of Roman Jakobson at Columbia University and then at Harvard just after World War II. And Halle, like Jakobson, had to flee Europe with the rise of Nazism. Halle went to college on the GI Bill after the war, and then he went to graduate school at the University of Chicago, then at Columbia and at Harvard, as I say. Well, Chomsky's first major proposal was this, that in order to be a science, linguists had to develop a formal linguistic theory which would characterize precisely what a grammar was, and in particular, a grammar would be a formal device which in turn would characterize all and only the grammatical sentences of a language. So you have the linguistic theory, it characterizes what a grammar is, and a grammar is a device that characterizes all of the sentences in the language. And what else does a linguistic theory do? So a linguistic theory, on the one hand, gives a precise form for a grammar, but Chomsky added another condition to what a linguistic theory must do or be. And he said it had to make clear how the choice of a grammar relates to linguistic evidence or data. And this may seem simple or obvious, but it wasn't and it isn't. And Chomsky proposed three options. And he drew a chart essentially like this. I've added the color. And he proposed these three alternatives. And the first was that the linguistic theory could be viewed as a discovery procedure, a formal device that takes data as its input and produces the correct grammar of the data as its output. That's at the top. And the next best option would be that a theory could serve as a verification device. You would give it data and a grammar. It would tell you, no, that is or that isn't the right grammar for the data that you've written. And then there was this third position, the fallback position, which he proposed and opted for, which was that all linguistic theory needed to do was to provide an evaluation metric. You would give it your data and two grammars, and it would tell you which of the two grammars were better. And Chomsky later started using the term universal grammar instead of linguistic theory, so I'll use the two interchangeably. So Chomsky correctly or accurately observed that these three conceptions successively set weaker bars for what needs to be done. If we can't create a discovery device, maybe we can create a verification device. If we can't do that, maybe we can have an evaluation metric. Chomsky proposed, without any evidence, maybe some kind of intellectual modesty, but there's some other reasons I'll suggest in a second, that neither the first nor the second were possible, that neither of them were possible at that point, meaning the mid-50s. He said, we cannot develop a device that can extract grammatical generalizations from data, but what we can do is establish formal means for deciding which of two analyses is better. So I'm going to come back in a few minutes to talk about current attempts to meet the challenge of this top one, this top option. But before we move beyond Chomsky's early proposal, we need to look a bit more at how he proposed that we understand the third model. And here the crucial element to realize is this. The method that Chomsky proposed for linguistic theory to select the better of the two, here I'll move to the next slide, this is how he proposed to flesh out option 3. He proposed that it would not be on the basis of the data, but rather on the computation of the complexity, the computation of the simplicity of each of the grammars, and it was linguistic theory that would provide the details of how the simplicity would be measured. I know that's a bit abstruse, and I will explain it a little bit more. But you may ask, what role does data play in this? So what he was saying, linguistic theory is going to decide between two grammars, meaning the work of two grammarians, and the theory is going to make the decision based on the simplicity. Where does data come in? And here Chomsky's answer was sketchy and ultimately not all that adequate. And what he said was that we'd only consider grammars at this point that were consistent with the data, that generated the data in his words. What was crucially missing was any kind of account of how data confirmed or disconfirmed a particular grammar. And this problem, which was the problem of the nature of confirmation in science, was one that was widely discussed in the logical positivist philosophy of science during this period, in the post-war period, the 40s and the 50s into the 60s. And there was no clear answer available to any young man like Chomsky who was developing a theory, although most people felt that the smart money was betting on probabilistic measures, people like Rudolf Carnap here at Chicago and then at UCLA. What may not be obvious to us today as we read this or as you hear me explain it to you, is that this step that Chomsky took was actually an extremely liberating step. And that was really important in getting his revolution going from his perspective and that of his colleagues. Because they felt that linguistic theory, as it stood at that point, was built to keep their view of linguistics out. He who specifies the learning algorithm, in effect, specifies what can be learned. And Chomsky could see quite rightly, I think, that the kind of grammar he was interested in developing couldn't be discovered by the very rudimentary notions of automatic learning that existed at the time. To say they were rudimentary is being generous. By leaving out any prior restriction on what a grammar has to look like and only promising to submit an evaluation metric once it's done, early generative grammarians were free to develop an elegant and an abstract analysis. And there was a second argument that they offered for their position, and it's one that came also from the logical positivists. And this involves the context of discovery and the context of justification. So this was a notion that came also from Rudolf Carnap and Hans Reichenbach, two of the logical positivists I mentioned earlier. They both said it's of no particular interest to the scientist or the philosopher of science what the reason was for how a scientist came to arrive at a new idea. That account was simply to speak to the context of discovery, and that wasn't important. All that matters for the scientist is how the idea can be justified, how she can provide arguments based on evidence and on previously accepted conclusions in favor of the new idea. And both Chomsky and Halley took this to heart. They took this to refer both to the development of linguistic theory and to the discovery of the best grammar of a given language. Those were two very different things, though. So you have to bear in mind, we're talking about linguistic theory, which helps you figure out what a grammar is, and grammar, which then explains how a particular language works. So Chomsky's proposal was this, that linguistic theory should be understood henceforth as the search for a restrictive formal language in which grammars are written. And if we do this properly, then for any given language, the correct grammar will be the shortest of all the grammars that are consistent with the data. Why no method for projecting grammars from data? Well, at times, Chomsky and Halley both took the position that coming up with a grammar for a language is like coming up with a theory in physics, and you don't need a theory for that, you just need to be smart. But times change, as we'll see. That statement was accepted at the time, and it was taken at that time as a moment of methodological liberation. Okay, so that's the end of what I want to say about generative grammar, but I want you to take away three points here. There's three big questions. The first is, where do hypotheses come from? And the answer is, as you recall, as far as linguistic theories, ideas about linguistic theory goes, well, it's none of your business. Ideas come from wherever they come from. As far as individual grammars are concerned, well, the ideas can come from anywhere, but mostly they come from looking at what other linguists do in describing other languages. You want to describe Swahili, you look at how people are working on Russian and English and Chinese. Second big question, how do we determine the extent to which data support a hypothesis? And that was the question to which the generative grammarians had no answer. And it was the problem of the problem of confirmation that was an unsolved problem at that point in philosophy of science. And then the third is, how do we determine the goodness of a theory independent of data? And that's the idea that it really sounds bizarre to a non-linguist. I will have to admit it if you find that an odd question. But I hope that it'll become a little bit clearer as we move along. You want to be able to choose between theories independent of the data. What's a better theory? Okay, let's turn from this, by way of background, turn to machine learning. Today, machine learning is an important part of the research and the curriculum in any department of computer science or statistics. And its methods are studied and used in a wide range of places across campus, including schools of business, schools of medicine, public policy. And I believe it has the potential to shed new light on some of the fundamental questions of linguistics as well. And that's what I'll try to show you, literally show you. I'm hoping that I will persuade you with what you see with your eyes. What is machine learning? It's a set of conceptual tools that are expressed and explored in the language of mathematics. And its goal is to discover structure in data using implementation in modern digital computers in order to realize those ideas, to implement the ideas. And the phrase itself, machine learning, is a bit paradoxical because we expect that it's people who will learn and not machines. And before machine learning came to be, when computer engineers wanted to get a computer to do something intelligent, the conventional wisdom was that they would go to a human expert. If they wanted the computer to play chess, they would go to a chess grandmaster, and they would ask the grandmaster what he or she did when they encountered problems in playing a game of chess. They would take all those answers, they would sew them together and come up with a computer program, which would then be given to a computer. The computer would implement that program slavishly. So in that view of things, computers might be intelligent, but they wouldn't learn. They would have their knowledge spoon-fed to them, so to speak, a serum that comes from the thought patterns of the human beings. And perhaps an intelligence that doesn't learn doesn't really deserve the description of intelligence. Well, from the early days of the computer, the 40s, the World War II, right up to the 80s, that was the dominant and nearly universal view, that computers could do nothing other than step through algorithms that were put together by human beings. Knowledge was created by human beings in their capacity as creative thinkers, and computers could perform a lot of computations, following up on the insights that came from humans. And that picture has changed now. Even back in the 1950s, there were a few holdouts, and one holdout group was the people who worked on neural nets. You may know about that style of work. Scientists who were developing neural nets were joined in the 1980s by other workers in statistics and mathematics and computer science who were all discovering that they had an arsenal of methods that they could use in order to attack serious and interesting problems of learning. So where was linguistics in all of this? And if we adopt the point of view of machine learning, then the central question of linguistics is, how can the interesting structure that linguists have discovered in linguistic data, in language data, how can those generalizations be discovered algorithmically, by which I mean automatically? If we succeed in identifying these algorithms, can we do better linguistics? Can we do maybe faster linguistics? And if we can't discover those algorithms, why not? People can learn languages. Why are we not able to uncover algorithms that do it? Either way the questions are answered, the answers are going to be interesting. Now, generative grammar plays a major role in setting the boundary conditions for a theory of learning. Generative grammar plays an important role in describing what it is that speakers know. But generative grammar and machine learning could certainly both profit from a closer working relationship. Machine learning then tells us to go back and tackle head-on what Chomsky described as the most difficult challenge, to find an algorithm that induces structure from data. Oh, those are our questions. So it tells us to go back and look at option 1. Generative grammar and machine learning agree on this, that growing the space of grammars when needed is a good thing. I'll explain that in a second. When we discover, as we study more languages, that we need more formal options in our set of tools, then we'll have to extend our set of tools. And shrinking the space of grammars is important too. If we have something in our theory of grammar that's never used in a human language, we're better off taking it out of that toolbox. But machine learning says, in addition, a linguistic theory needs a method to find the grammar within the given hypothesis space that best accounts for the data. I put together the following cartoon for you. I hope it explains something better than words. So suppose we're starting off linguistic theory, and we've studied 2 languages. Suppose they were English and Hebrew, 2 unrelated languages. We've got grammars for them. And those are the two lozenges, the 2 diamonds there. We construct a linguistic theory, that's the yellow around it. It's a theory that says this is what a grammar can be. Any spot within me is a possible grammar. And of course, we're going to create a linguistic theory that includes the only grammars we've got. So somebody goes out and works on a 3rd language, Swahili perhaps. And unfortunately, that analysis seems to show that something additional is needed in linguistic theory. So we expand the theory of linguistics in order to accommodate what Swahili has taught us about how natural language works. And now we've got a revised universal grammar. This is our new linguistic theory. And we stay with that for a while, and then somebody notices, you know, there's this big void there. There aren't any languages that anybody's found which are headed off there on the right-hand side of our yellow box. Maybe we really don't need that. So the proposal then becomes sent out to the world. Let's get rid of that. Let's say those are not possible languages, and we'll shrink our universal grammar. And so now we have a revised universal grammar. And we work some more, and somebody finds another grammar, perhaps Eskimo, any language, we work on it, we find a grammar, it's outside of universal grammar. And so we extend linguistic theory in order to include it. And so the theory, the model here, what we expect is that as the years and the decades go on, linguistic theory will expand and contract in such a way that those diamonds, which are the languages that we've explored in depth, will fill up a large part of that yellow space. And there won't be any areas of possible languages which aren't represented anywhere among the languages that we've studied. That's the general perspective of how linguistic theory should evolve in the context of generative grammar. Machine learning adds to it the following notion, which doesn't fit into the pictures you've seen up to now. It says, no matter what set of grammars we're looking at, no matter where our family of grammars is within linguistic theory, when somebody's got a set of data, which is that red box there, when somebody's got a set of data, what we need is an algorithm, and typically these algorithms work iteratively, so that's why I've put there that 1, 2, 3, n. We need an algorithm which will find the best grammar within our current universe, the best grammar to describe the data that you've brought. In generative grammar, skip over these pictures. We can get a clearer understanding of these two perspectives, the generative and the machine learning perspective, if we listen in on a conversation between two linguists of each persuasion. And you're going to listen in. These linguists are both me. The voices you're about to hear are both my own, and I've had this internal conversation for quite a few years. And the generative grammarian will typically look at what the machine learning person is doing and say, you're looking at a set of grammars and trying to automatically determine which is the best analysis of our data from inside that set. But you always seem to choose easy problems to solve, the cases where we already know the right solution and have known it for a long time. It's like yesterday's news. And to this, the machine learning linguist says, no, you don't get it. I'm intentionally focusing on those problems where we agree on what the right answer is. The problem I'm attacking now, in principle, the problem I'm attacking now is how, in principle, the right answer could have been learned, inferred, induced, figured out from the linguistic data. And the generative grammarian sighs and he says, but the examples you're looking at are just too simple. Let me tell you about the problem I'm working on right now. I'm working on relative clauses in Swahili, and they're really complicated. And when I explain to you how they work, you're going to agree with me that your machine learning methods are ill-equipped to shed any light on how relative clauses are formed in Swahili. So remind me, why should I be paying attention to anything you're doing? To which the machine learning linguist says, well, I'm working on finding methods for automatic learning of problems that are found in many languages and for which we'll agree on what the right answer is. Turns out that coming up with an automatic learner for even these problems that you call simple is very hard. And I'm focusing on those aspects of language for which there's no reasonable hypothesis that the answer is somehow wired into our brains. So you remember the three major questions that we talked about a moment ago. This was, where do hypotheses come from? How do we determine the extent to which data support a hypothesis? And the third is, how do we determine the goodness of a theory independent of data? And machine learning has its answers for each of those, and I'd like to explain them because I think the answers are all a bit surprising and interesting. First, where do hypotheses come from? I said before, 50 years ago, that there wasn't much of an answer. Machine learning has a different kind of an answer. It's almost bureaucratic. Machine learning says, first of all, we have a lot of formalisms developed already for quite a few interesting and complex phenomena. Each of these formalisms includes billions and billions of particular examples, but we have various ways that we've worked on for searching in a rational way through this space of hypotheses. Of course, we don't pretend that researchers won't come up with new models and new formalisms. This happens every year. There's no end to them. So to answer the question, where do hypotheses come from? The answer is this. If we work with formalisms that we've already developed, then we can use some established techniques to search automatically for particular hypotheses for your linguistic problems. But if none of our off-the-shelf models work, then we have to employ good old-fashioned human creativity and come up with a new model. And this holds both at the level of theory and coming up with grammars. Second, how do we decide how well a hypothesis explains a set of data? And here there are several answers. This is really central to what statisticians worry about all the time. They look at the difference between what's predicted and what's observed. But in the case of linguistic data, that approach rarely works because what we have is a sample of linguistic data, and there's nothing that's predicted, which just we have to explain what we find. And one very important paradigm in machine learning uses probability to deal with this. And if I had an extra hour to talk to you tonight, I would talk about probability in this context. We use probability here in a way that's completely different from the impression you get in middle school. When you first learn about probability, you learn about calculating what the probability is of rolling 3 6s with 5 rolls of a die or something like that. But what we do here is use probability in our models not to calculate the right probability, but rather to evaluate the models. It's like asking a question on an SAT exam. We don't put a question on an SAT exam to find out what the right answer is. We know the right answer. And we put the question on the test to evaluate the student. And that's what we do here as well. We make a probabilistic model and test the model, test alternative models on the data, evaluating how good the model is based on the probability that it assigns to the data. And finally, how can we evaluate the goodness of a grammar independent of data? And this is a problem that's central to the notion of Kolmogorov complexity. And if I had a second hour or a third, I might talk about that, but I won't do it tonight. Instead, what I'm going to do is talk to you about 3 particular problems that are interesting and even fun and involve computational linguistics. The first problem is that of word learning. The second is of learning morphology, which means the internal structure of words. And then the third is really wild stuff, astral projection kind of stuff, which I hope you'll find as interesting and as beautiful as I do. So the first example here is word learning. And what does that mean? Word learning is the problem that's actually faced by any child who learns a language. A child hears speech coming in. There are no spaces between the words. I first encountered this problem around 1996. I read a dissertation by Carl DeMarkin. It was a dissertation in computer science at MIT. He was a young man who knew a lot of linguistics. He wrote an algorithm that would take a long string of symbols from which the spaces had been taken out if there ever were spaces. And the purpose of the algorithm was to put the spaces back in, or to put it another way, to figure out what the words are in that language sample that's given. So here you see an example. We input to the algorithm, to the computer, perhaps the equivalent of 1 million words without spaces. There's a famous corpus that I'll be referring to called the Brown corpus. It was made at Brown University. And if I take all the spaces out, we've got about 5 million symbols, which corresponds to about 5 million words in real life. We take out all the spaces, and so part of what you see is that first line up there, which I won't try to read to you. What we'd like the algorithm to produce is what you see in the middle. The Fulton County Grand Jury said Friday an investigation of Atlanta's recent primary election, etc. Now, in my implementation of DeMarkin's algorithm, the actual output was the Fulton County and Jury said Friday an investigation of, that's an interesting one, Atlanta's recent primary election produced no evidence that any irregularities took place. Well, it's interesting. It's not quite right. And when you look at some of the errors it's making, you can see why it's tempted to treat grand as gr plus and, because it's figured out that and is a common word. It's doing a lot of things right, but it isn't really hitting the nail on the head. Let me show you the inside of what it's doing. On the first iteration, what it's doing at each time is it's beginning with the assumption that at the very beginning, each letter is an individual word. The lexicon or the vocabulary of the language consists just of the individual symbols. And on each iteration, it puts together those chunks which appear next to one another frequently, and it considers those as its hypotheses, and it evaluates each such chunk to see whether the analysis of the entire data would be improved if we included it. So in the first iteration, it has only pairs of letters to put together, but it finds these, and as luck would have it, it gets half a dozen of words correctly, because in and an and on and at and to and or really are words in English, although of course many of these ONs that it's grabbing here are part of larger words, like any word that has ION in it. On the 10th iteration, it's also doing some cool stuff. It's finding in with a capital I and some and who and capital he. It's more form, but it's also making some errors. So EDTHE, that's an interesting one. It's clearly picked up the ed suffix off a verb and the of the following object, like he photographed the view. So the ed and the the, both of which have much higher frequency than whatever was the verb stem, is being pulled out as a word, because the system has only one way to deal with a regularity that it discovers. It's like a man who's got a hammer. He sees a lot of nails. And it's got only one way to analyze them. We go down to the 399th iteration, and it's doing a lot of good stuff. It's finding the words divided, minimal, Baltimore, fever, thickness, contains. West Berlin isn't right, but you wouldn't want you wouldn't feel too bad if we had to treat West Berlin as a word. But then there's some serious errors back in choice of, attention to the, it, the, and so forth. So it's falling into that same problem It's finding pieces that are too big. So what's the problem? The problem is that there are generalizations in language, not just at the level of the word. There's structure inside the word, what linguists call morphology, and there's structure higher than the word. There's phrases and there's even sentences. So we look at the algorithm, we can see it's not perfect, but the problem is not a problem of detail. It's a fundamental problem. Until we can create a language learner that recognizes there are multiple levels of structure and it can attack all of these levels at the same time, we're never going to be able to solve the problem. So I found this bracing as a challenge and set myself on the task of learning morphology. So I began to work on an algorithm that would look specifically for word internal structure, what we call morphology, as I said. And this took several years, and I'm not really done yet, but the results have been very interesting, and it's been an awful lot of fun. The results have ultimately been very good. And I call the program Linguistic, a bit of a tip of the hat to Mathematica. So the task is what? It's to write an algorithm that assumes no knowledge of any language, and which takes as its input some sample of the language, maybe a few thousand words with spaces. Words, maybe 1 million, 5 million, whatever you've got on hand of your language, whatever is available. And the output should be an explicit algorithm itself, which analyzes the words of the language into their subparts, the roots and the prefixes and the suffixes and so forth. And this turns out to be an extremely difficult task. Once you know a language, it's perfectly obvious how the words are divided up into parts most of the time, not always. But specifying how we can get there independently of any language turns out to be a real challenge. The easiest part consists of finding prefixes and suffixes that create one new word out of another, what linguists call derivational suffixes. So in English, we have quite a few. We have a prefix like out, which you can attach to an intransitive verb. John thinks, but Mary outthought John. It turns an intransitive verb into a transitive verb. We can attach it occasionally to a noun. You can outmaneuver somebody, or you can outrank somebody. And we've got lots and lots of suffixes like IZE. You can capitalize something, you can hospitalize someone, and so forth. So we've got lots of examples like that. Now, the other big part of morphology, which we call inflectional morphology, deals with patterns in a paradigm. You may remember Latin or Spanish from a long time ago. English has such paradigms that are pretty simple. For nouns, we've got singulars and plurals. For verbs, most verbs have 4 forms. So walk, walked, walks, walking. We've got a null form or a bare form. I'll talk about the bare form from now on, meaning like walk or jump. And we can add an S, an ED, an ING. So the results are really very good for these challenges in English. And so this is an example of just a very small part of the generalizations that Linguistica pulls out in looking at English. And there's just a handful of the stems that it finds below at the bottom of the slide. And it finds these stems here at the bottom, which are parallel to that blue row of words: account, accounted, accounting, accounts. Stuff that we all know, but the algorithm discovers on its own. This here is a picture a little bit less friendly. This is a finite state automaton, and this is really what the output of the program creates. So this is what a computer scientist's view of what a morphology looks like. So if we start from this node at the top that says start, any path that'll take us down to the bottom will generate a word of the language that was in the data that was input to the program. So economically would be a word, and it's broken up into those pieces, just as vigorous, null, or vigorously, and so forth. So that all works fine. But there are challenges and there are problems. And so now, take a look at this chart here of 6, when we could have 60 different patterns up here. There are various ways of forming the past tense in English. It goes back to the history of the language. It doesn't matter. We've got a lot of different forms right now. And if our morphology learner is going to figure out that these forms all have something in common, they have the same function, we're going to have to go beyond just the word internal structure. And the problem I'm going to discuss with you now is one that Jackson Lee, one of my students in linguistics, is writing a dissertation on. So we've got some really interesting stuff here. What we need is a new device. We need a device that'll show us how words are used. We need what I call a megascope. We need something that, it's not a microscope because it doesn't take, we don't need to look up close at English. We've got all the English we need. It's not a telescope because we don't want to take something far away and bring it close. What we need is a megascope. We need something that takes something close and makes it far away. We need a device that allows us to see a forest when we're standing in front of trees. We need a device that will take this beautiful picture of the Milky Way and show us what it looks like from the outside. That's a beautiful picture of M51. And the Milky Way would look a lot like that if we were far enough away from it. So that's what we need. We need a megascope. And I thought I had something cool here, but not surprisingly, 60 years ago, they already had megascopes out there. It was a 6-way space control, 6 toys in one. And actually, Tom Swift had a megascope space prober as well. So maybe I just had it buried away in my memory. But I think that my megascope is a lot cooler. So let me show you first some pictures, first some stills, so you get a little bit oriented. And actually, this megascope has something in common with telescopes and microscopes. It's been observed by historians of science and middle school students that it takes a while to figure out, for your brain to understand what it's seeing when you look through a telescope or a microscope. And it's going to be true here with a megascope. I can see it fairly well now. You're seeing it for the first time. It may not be quite so obvious. So here's some stills from the megascope. This is a picture of English Encarta. So Encarta is Microsoft's encyclopedia. It's just a large corpus of some 15 million words. And I ran it through the megascope. And what you see is this picture here. And if we could zoom down in, and we'll do some of that zooming in a minute, we would see out here, this part here are years. They're things like 1902, 1789, 2005. They're all out here. Well, let me back up a second. This is a graph. There are nodes in here. There's little dots. Those dots are words. There are 4,000 dots. They're the 4,000 most common words in Encarta. In an encyclopedia, there may be 50 or 60,000 different words. So 4,000 is a good subset of that. We look down here, over here, we've got nouns, down here, adjectives. And over here, this is the exciting part, we've got all those past tense verbs. That's really what I created this for, in order to find some way to automatically discover all the past tense verbs. So that actually it does very well, and I'll come back to that. But what is so cool is it's doing a lot of other things at the same time. All of our auxiliary verbs, I'll explain those in a minute. They're words like could and should and must. They're right here. Our bear verbs, you remember I told you about them, like jump and walk and sing. They're here. Our prepositions are here. John, Charles, men's first names are here. It's an encyclopedia, after all. There are a lot of them, and they're all right together. So this is a still. It's much more interesting in its dynamic version, and I'll get to it, but I'm just trying to give you a sense of what it's going to look like. And I also want to compare what you're seeing here to French. So I happen to have Encarta in French as well. It's not the same articles. Some of them are translations, but it's a different encyclopedia, but about the same size. And you look at this. Does it look different to you? It's actually very different. I'll put the two next to one another, but before I do, just point out that these limbs that come out here are grammatically very homogeneous. We've got masculine singular nouns here. You all know French has masculine nouns and feminine nouns. Feminine singulars are over here. Plural nouns are down here. Pre-nominal modifiers, by which I mean things like numbers and the word for this and that and my and your, are here. Simple past verbs are here. All the years are separate in a sister galaxy, which is just sliding away from it, moving out. You'll see it actually move out of its neighborhood. Cities are over here. So each dot is a word, and the words are connected by threads. Each word is connected to the five most similar words to it, and those threads can't break, but they can stretch. Okay, so here's a picture of French and English next to one another. And you see they're very, very different. The French words divide up clearly into different subparts, those different limbs. Okay, I want to show you, we have a little bit of a technical challenge here. We hope that this works. I want to show you some of these videos. This is English blowing up. So this is Encarta. I just want to give you a sense, your visual cortex, a sense of what it's looking at. So you've got 4,000 nodes here, and those threads are linking them. I'm going to blow it up a couple times so you see what it's looking at. So these limbs are pulling out, and these dense areas are word types, like I say, nouns, adjectives, prepositions, and so forth. One more time, I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you see a little bit more closely. There are these various limbs. And okay, this is essentially the same thing, but I've put it at the right size so it all fits in the frame, so you can see all the limbs coming out. Okay, so this is 4,000 words, and I haven't given you a sense yet as to which words are where. And what I'm going to show you next is actually just about the first thing that I did along these lines. So it's the brown corpus. It's a little bit smaller. Here we go. You can see it's a little bit smaller, but the limbs that come out are much sharper. And what I did here is took a video of myself doing it, going in, and I'm going to blow it up, and we're going to look at the individual words there. And over here on the side, I'm going to come in with a microscope and look at the megascope. Come in, come on. Here we go. And so over there are letters. They're probably just the middle initials in somebody's name, but they're put in a separate area. Here what we have are the words the, his, its, a. It's these prenominal determiners. Here's the nominal pronouns of English. Go over there. We've got the prepositions of English. Go to the next spot. We pull in. And here we've got the modal auxiliaries. Will, may, could, should, might, must, can. Pulling in a little bit. We've got the negative forms of them. And here we've got other auxiliary verbs. Go up to the top. We've got numbers. And over there we turn, and we've got the bare verbs that I mentioned. And so what we have here is essentially that projection from data to grammar. Okay, now here, what I'm going to show you is English annotated. So I want to show you, I want to tell you a little bit of what the annotation means here. Okay, so just remember one or two colors. This will not be on the final. So the bare verbs are in red, past tense verbs are in blue, and some of the other forms are color-coded there as well. Auxiliary verbs are in green, prepositions are in aqua, and so forth. Okay, so with that in mind, let's look at this. Let's pull it out again. And watch it explode. So these are the infinitives, the red. These are the past tense, the blue. I'm going to stop it for a second. These are auxiliary verbs, and up here are prepositions. Over here, we've got names of cities, and here we've got adjectives, which clearly have nothing to do with one another. And I'm going to let it go. So let me explain a little bit more what this means now, let it go. So there's a dynamic to them. There's an iteration going on. And what's happening in these cases is that there's a strong repelling force between every node. So there's this kind of an explosion, kind of like with the Big Bang of the universe. And everything is being pushed away from one another. And the only thing that's holding things together are the threads. And so what emerges is the structure of the threads. So watch this as it evolves. We've got the inside of this body here gradually changing. The prepositions are moving down here. And there's two things that are connected. These blue dots are moving down over here. These green are going to move over. The blue's going to move over. And this part up here is going to restructure itself. So the adjectives are just about to move over to the right and separate themselves from the places. These are names of cities and countries. And it's opening up. I must admit, I find this breathtaking. I've watched it over and over and put on these little codes and look to see exactly what is it that it's learning. So as it's shifting in order to essentially find a state of lowest energy. There's a certain sense in which this is a structure and there's an energy level to the entire system. And this is a change in time. It's a dynamical system in a sense, but it's not a time in a linguistics. It's not in the sense of time going on in reality. It's a computational sense of time. And what is emerging out of this is a picture of the relationship between these two words, between these words in the language. I said that there would be a challenge here with this. The edges, the connecting two nodes, each word has 5 of those edges, has 5 edges which connected to the words that are most similar to it. So the way that they are determined is this. So we start with the original corpus, and every word, we indicate for each word what words appear to its left and to its right, and what the morphological properties are of those words. That's stuff that we'd already learned from the morphological analysis in the previous section. So we have all that information. That gives us an enormous glob of data, which is far too complex to do anything with. But what we do is, using techniques of machine learning, embed this in a space of 10 dimensions. So we basically start with a graph. We compute what's called the normalized Laplacian of the graph. And with the eigenvectors of that computation, we embed the words in a space of 10 dimensions. Each word then can look around it and say, what words are closest to me? What words are most similar to me? And each one picks 5, and that's what those threads indicate. So those threads are an indication with each word what words it thinks are closest to it. Yeah. So, does that answer your question? Okay. Let's see if I can. Yes, I want to show you this. This illustrates the dynamic of here. So I took 6 words, the big dog, and the French equivalent, le gros chien. And I attached the 3 English words to one another with these threads, and the 3 French words to each other with these threads. And then I put them randomly in spots. And I'll show you what random means here. And of course, it's the algorithm that computed the random numbers. So that's random. That's random. That's random, 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 random. That's what random means. We're going to explode it now, and that's what happens when you explode it. It's the structure of the threads that determines what we see after that. So there's random. When you explode it, it's the structure of the strings that comes through, and that's what we're interested in after all. It's the structure of the strings, which are stretchable but unbreakable. And so that's what this explosion does. It allows us to see what the structure is of the threads. And so if you have an ambiguous word at this level, at this very simple level, if you have an ambiguous word, in French, for example, the word porte, P-O-R-T-E, stretches across between there's one leg for feminine nouns, because it means a door, and it stretches as well to the inflected verbs, because it's also the third person singular for the verb to carry. So in the end, let me show you this as an example. If we can look at subparts of the graph. No, it's not working. To show us what some of the selected sub-areas are. And when we do that, we can discover, as I indicated before, that the past tense verbs all share a syntactic function with one another. So let me conclude. First, one of the conclusions that I draw from this work is that one must not fear asking simple and elementary questions. Perhaps you can imagine how silly it sounds to say to somebody, I'm working on the problem of taking out the spaces in a large corpus and figuring out if I can put them back in again. It's like the guy who goes to a doctor and he says, "Doctor, I find that if I stand on my head too long, my elbow hurts. What should I do?" And the doctor says, "Well, stop standing on your head." And of course, the problem is not getting the spaces back in. The problem is, what was it that got the spaces there in the first place? And it raises an interesting and scientific question about language. When I mentioned this to Ridge Scott quite a few years ago now, more than 10 years ago, he said, "Well, that's exactly what we need for the problems of bioinformatics and trying to figure out what the lexicon is in the genome." I've sketched for you some of the principal reasons that I take Chomsky's generative grammar and the modern field of machine learning as two approaches to similar questions. I mean, each is a product of its time and its generation, and each makes different assumptions and defines different, though related, goals. And each can help the other sharpen its methods and its targets. I mean, one of my strongest impressions of the differences between the two approaches is this. When you're working with a machine learning, in order to learn how to induce structure, it leads you to far more complete surprises than does working in the context of generative grammar. I can't tell you how many times looking at this material here has drawn my attention to facts that I simply had no idea of. And there are puzzles in generative grammar as well, of course, and we can argue about alternative ways to formalize a generalization. But if we want to be surprised by Mother Nature, in this case, Mother Language, over and over again, then machine learning tools are an excellent path to follow. And finally, this work has convinced me of the importance of data visualization for exploration in linguistic analysis. I had no idea what the geometric picture and the geometric structure was what we would find that would emerge as we pulled out this linguistic metascope before looking at the output. I was totally stunned, and as I say, I still am. And we may be on the threshold of a moment when data visualization can become as important a tool in linguistic analysis, in syntax, and in morphology, as it is, for example, already in chemistry and biology. And there you are. As I tell my students in computational linguistics, we're trying to solve the scientific questions of linguistics with the mathematical tools of machine learning. And sometimes, on a very good day, the results that emerge are quite literally beautiful. Thank you. I'd be happy to take some questions. How are we going to do this? Are there microphones? Bill.
John, how do you decide whether to use 5 as opposed to 3 or 7 links? Is there some other principle going there?
Not yet. And so I try them all and look, and sometimes you get a better image one way or the other. My decision here as to which one I chose was based in part on how fast it takes to settle in. In the long run, there isn't one right answer for all words, I think. Clearly, there are a lot of next steps to take, and I thought about whether I would mention some of them. So, for example, I've described this as a upstream to downstream approach, where we start with context, what I was calling context, and end up with these graphs. But these graphs can then be used to return upstream to determine which contexts are more important, for example. So how many strings? No, there isn't any simple answer. And another way to answer your question is to say, what we're really looking for is some kind of maybe a manifold, something. It's not really a manifold because it doesn't have a consistent dimensionality, but what's the structure of the object in which the words are embedded? There's some kind of object in which the words are, so what kind of local structure does it have? Everything I've been describing here is sort of global structure, and that's very interesting, but there must be some kind of local structure. So one thing I didn't show you is the difference between what the auxiliary verbs look like locally and nouns. They look very different. The auxiliary verbs, there's just a small family of them. So can we use mathematical tools of geometry to say something about that? I'd love to know, and I intend to find out.
So I was quite intrigued by the difference in shape between the English and the French structure. So I'm wondering, how do you account for that difference? Or to put another way, if we had an Encarta for, say, Chinese or Russian or West Greenlandic, what would you expect the differences in the charts to be?
Well, the answer to what I would expect those to be, in all modesty, what I've learned is that my expectations are worth nothing. They're worth absolutely nothing. That's what makes this so interesting. It's not the case that I can say, oh, I know Chinese is this kind of a language, and therefore what I'm going to find is that. It's not that at all. It's teaching us stuff that I didn't know. So in the input, in this stream of data manipulation that I was describing, at the beginning there was both morphology and there was information about what words are next to one another. And in the method that I've described to you, I have blended the two together. So when we look at these pictures here, we can't tell, I can't tell, we can't tell, which is the most important effect, our knowledge of the morphology, our knowledge of syntax. And so clearly an important thing to do, a next thing to do, is to pull those different factors apart. And that would be one way to begin to have an answer to the question. Well, let me back up. No, instead, say rather, if we weight more heavily different kinds of information, morphological, syntactic, semantic, that's going to have an impact on the overall, the global shape of the image that is formed. So right now, I'm giving you these pretty pictures, so to speak, and they really are pretty, or maybe the word is beautiful. But I can't say to you, this is morphology, this is syntax. For my money, I would say French is the way it looks because the morphology is clearer, that in English you have far too many words that are ambiguous in their use. The word, like, can be a verb, can be a preposition, it can be all sorts of things. It can even be a noun. So we've got lots and lots of words like that. That's less true in French, and I think that's probably a good part of why the two look so different, but I haven't tested it, and 2 is not a good sample. Was that Tamara? I could hear your voice. Was that you? Okay.
So I have 2 questions. My first question is, how far can you go in the chain? So you talk about DeMarkin's work, then you talk about your work, and then you can talk about this work. Is the error in between each one of those small enough where you can just start with DeMarkin, feed it into Linguistica, then do this projection, and get something that resembles if you had the ground truth to begin with? And then my second question is, where does traditional sort of predicate-based semantics fit into this? Because this is purely sort of probabilistic, and I was wondering if there is a way, have you thought of sort of bridging the two traditions of AI, I guess?
Yeah. So the first question, I haven't done it, and it's a perfect topic for a PhD dissertation. There's absolutely no reason why a person couldn't get started this summer and be done in 2 years. So it's just the right level, and I really want someone to do it. So that's the answer to it. It's great. We're just waiting to do it. So that's one thing. And then the second, well, my colleague, as you know, Greg Koblet, works on the syntax semantic side of things, and we have talked about putting the two together. We haven't done it yet, in part because there's this sense that if you're going to put syntax or formal words together with meanings, you need to have access. Raw access to meaning is hard to get. Let me say that another way. You've probably gotten the sense from what I've been saying to you that the part of the methodology here is that all the data is kind of raw. It's unprocessed. It just comes from somewhere. And it's very difficult to get semantic information that way. How do you say what the meaning is of a sentence? You need to have somebody's theory of the meaning, and maybe semanticians agree enough on what the meaning is that we can have a graduate student sit down and write out what the meaning is, and we can deal with that as if it were raw. But maybe not. Maybe that's really too much theory. There's too much theory in that. Some people have suggested that if you've got 2 translations of the same text, say the Bible in 2 languages, that each is a sort of a poor semantic representation of the other. You can use each language as sort of a semantic representation. It's a kind of an appealing idea. But you have to to answer your second question, you've got to make some kind of decision about what the information is that you're going to have access to that represents the meaning. And I don't know the answer yet.
We have time for one more question.
Some of the questions that you posed, some of the problems reminded me of when I got involved with the breaking of the German Enigma code. Has anybody in your field published or looked into the reasoning and the solutions that came up in World War II in this area? Because it seems to me that Turing has solved some of this stuff and even has a machine that did it.
Mm-hmm. I'd say a partial yes, and it's partial in part because I just don't know what everybody has done. There's certainly a continuous stream of scholarship between people doing this kind of computational linguistics and people working in cryptography on the other hand. And interestingly, I think at least one of the places where those interests all focus together is something that's called the Voynich manuscript. Have any of you heard of the Voynich manuscript who are not students here? The Voynich manuscript goes back several centuries, and we don't know if it's a fraud or a real language. And so there's this real sense in which it's a cryptographic problem. We don't know what language it represents, if it's a real language. And so there are people who have come, a lot of people from the NSA who have worked on that, who've tackled that problem, and people in computational linguistics, me a little bit, who have worked on that. And that seems like a very natural way to get communities to speak to one another, because people literally from those two communities are already working on that. I don't know of anything, but I'd love to speak to you more about it, about specifically along the lines of what I've described here that would come out of what Turing did, but I'd certainly love to know. Thank you then.